Okay, hi everyone. So today we're going to be looking at Romanian orphan studies. So I gave you a little bit of a kind of prep task for this at the end of last week, which was to watch a documentary on eStream called From Romania with Love. And then I gave you a couple of articles of studies to read that we're going to go through today. So we're kind of just really going to be tying everything in from that lesson today. So hopefully you'll manage to watch the documentary. It's a really good one, and we're going to be looking at the actual research in this lesson. So a bit of history or background and a bit of information really as to why we actually look at Romanian orphan studies and what the kind of aim of that is. So originally it kind of started off as somebody who took over Romania, so a guy called Ceausescu, who had some quite bizarre rules that he kind of put into place. So one of his first kind of things that he decided was that nobody was allowed to have any abortions. He also denied any access to any contraception. So you can kind of imagine that because of no contraception but also no abortions, there was a massive sudden rise in children. He also decided that there was a law that you should have a minimum of 5 children per woman. So you've got kind of a recipe for disaster, and there was just thousands and thousands and thousands of these children that they just couldn't be looked after really by their parents. So they ended up having to have all of these institutions in Romania that were just filled with just babies because they couldn't be looked after. So that's kind of the start of the Romanian orphan issue. So in terms of why we're actually studying this, so obviously it was a very unfortunate occurrence, but it is a naturally occurring phenomenon. So when we looked at research methods, we looked at kind of natural experiments being ones that sort of occur by themselves, and then psychologists take the opportunity to actually study the effects of that naturally occurring event. So it might be a natural disaster like a tsunami and then looking at behaviours afterwards, or it might be looking at behaviours after the emergence of social media or something like that. So the Russian orphan problem was a naturally occurring situation. So psychologists saw that happening and they thought it was a good opportunity to actually look at the effects of those children's attachments, you know, because the fact that they probably would have very poor attachments because they were in these institutions, these orphanages, and looking at their behaviours and their development. So there's two key studies. These were the studies that I gave you to have a little read of. So there's a Rutter ERA, so that stands for English Romanian Adoption Study, and then there is the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. So these are the studies that you should have read and should have made some sort of summary notes on these. So you should have a rough idea what they're kind of going to get into. So in terms of institutionalization, so the actual word is really describing behavior that children will display having been raised in an institution. So an institution is basically a group of people that are all there for a shared purpose, really. So an orphanage, a children's home, they're all there for one reason, and that's because they obviously have unfortunately been abandoned by their parents who couldn't look after them. So looking at institutionalization in orphanages and the behaviour patterns that those children display. So in the UK, there doesn't tend to be that big of a problem because there's usually lots of foster families that will be able to care for orphans. However, in Romania, it's not as easy to foster out children who are orphans. So they end up being placed in these large institutions where there's not that many carers, and if there are, there's sort of multiple ones. There won't be, you know, one carer to one baby. It will just kind of be shared, and then the effects of that tends to be kind of quite severe. So these are the sort of effects that you might get from institutionalization. So something called disinhibited attachment. So babies that kind of have been raised in these orphanages, they typically display some strange behaviour It might be that they are very affectionate towards complete strangers, or they may act exactly the same with people they're familiar with and strangers. So it's almost like they don't quite know how to react. They have no or little to none stranger anxiety. They just sort of, will kind of just take care from anybody because they're just happy to have anybody there. And this is supported by Rutter, who suggested that disinhibited attachment it tends to be a result with living with multiple caregivers during this sort of critical period. So the critical period we've come across quite a lot, especially with Bowlby's research, monotropy, and also maternal deprivation. So if you've got lots of different carers, they kind of just react the same to everybody. They don't tend to develop specific attachments. It can also cause damage to intellectual development and emotional development, and in some cases, or more severe cases, they can even show signs of mental retardation. So a lot of babies have poor development, but again, coming back to this idea of the critical period, those babies that were managed to be put into care, into foster care or adoption before 6 months old, so that's kind of before the critical period starts, they caught up, or they managed to catch up in terms of their development with control groups. So control groups are the ones that haven't really been adopted, or they have, but they've been adopted in England by the age of 4. So this is the sort of study, the first one, looking at Romanian and English adopted children. So Rutter, it's a longitudinal study, and it is actually still ongoing. So a longitudinal study is one that just goes on for years, and they examine the development over long periods of time. So they were looking at Romanian orphans who were adopted by UK families. So if you watch the documentary, it describes how when the kind of news broke that all these children in Romania hadn't got anybody to look after them and they were in these orphanages, they asked, they kind of put out a plea to families in the UK if they wanted to come over and adopt some of the orphans. So those orphans that had been adopted by UK families were compared to a control group of adopted children who were born in the UK. So they weren't Romanian, they were just English adoptees. And they were all placed in families before the age of 6 months. So they're basically just comparing the Romanian orphans to English orphans. So the reason they did this was to look at the effects of institutionalisation, so to see if there's any differences in behaviours and attachment behaviours, and whether a good care and early care before the critical period could compensate for the lack of attachment they got before. So it's almost like the earlier they are adopted, are they able to kind of reverse the damage that's been done? So they used the longitudinal study, and they had about 100 Romanian orphans and assessed them at different ages, and then they reassessed them 21 years later to see if it had had any effect on them kind of in adulthood as well. So these were the findings. You probably only need to know a couple of these things. So they basically found that children that were adopted by UK families before 6 months were, in terms of their development, normal when they were compared with children that were adopted at the same age from the UK. So they managed to catch up normally. However, any orphans, or many of the orphans that were adopted after 6 months, showed signs of disinhibited attachments. So it's quite obvious the conclusions there, in terms of there are consequences when this kind of separation or deprivation or failing to form an attachment, the longer it goes on for, the more severe the consequences tend to be. So if you adopt before the kind of start of the critical period, you have much more of a higher success rate of them developing normally compared to afterwards. So that was the first study, so that's the Rutter study. You've then got the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, and this one again was is quite similar, looking at 90 children who 90% of them had spent most of their life in institutional care. So these were sort of children that had a bit older, So they'd already gone through the critical period, and 90% of them had spent most of their life in these institutions, and they were compared to 50 children who had never lived in institutional care. So it's a straight up comparison. Children that were raised in institutions that you would assume to have poor attachment, and children who'd never been in institutional care. They used the strange situation, so we're familiar with that, and they basically just use that to assess their attachment type. So we know secure, insecure avoidant, and insecure resistant are the strange situation attachment types. So they did a sort of comparison, and this is what they found. So they found that 74% of the control group, so this was the group that had never been in institutional care, were found to be securely attached. So that's kind of the same sort of percentage that we would expect normally from the strange situation. However, only 19% of the institutional group were found to be securely attached. And of that, the institutionalized children, 44% of those match the description of disinhibited attachment, whereas only 20% of the control group fitted this description. So quite sort of significant findings there. So in terms of the evaluation, so all of the stuff we just talked about just now, that's been all AO1. I would actually like you to find these out. So these are things that you would be converting into Peel paragraphs. You can easily find the resources for this on places like Tutor2U or Simply Psychology. I want you to find out, I've given you the kind of starting bit, and then I want you to elaborate on these points. So I want you to firstly think about the practical applications. So what can we use, what can we gain, what sort of things can we have sort of got from these studies, what information does it provide us with in terms of how it helps us in our society, in terms of it might be how orphanages are run or how the foster care system operates, knowing things about the critical period and what that can mean for England and how we do things over here with that sort of thing. So think about the practical applications and the uses. I also want you to think about why Romanian orphan studies might be more valid than other normal orphanages. And what I'm kind of getting at here is looking at extraneous variables. So think about why people or why children are normally put into an orphanage. It tends to typically be because either their parents have passed away or they've been taken away from parents because of domestic issues. There could be some quite traumatic events that have taken place for a child to be placed in an orphanage. So consider those types of variables and how that sort of thing would affect the child's development and their behaviour compared to Romanian orphanages where there's been no traumatic experience. They've just literally, there's too many. So nothing horrible has happened to these children. They've just literally, they can't be looked after, there's too many. So think about why those studies in Romania might then be more valid than ones where there's been trauma involved when you are looking at behaviour and attachment. I also want you to have a look at why we might not be able to fully generalise the findings from Romanian orphan studies to other institutions. So what's different about Romanian orphan studies than other institutions? Were they massively overcrowded? Is it likely that they're going to get other emotions because of overcrowding, and is it going to be quite frustrating, and would that have an effect on their behaviour? All of those sorts of things. And then lastly, looking at long-term effects. So they were assessed at 21 years and younger. So what are the issues with that? So have a little think about the fact that maybe at 40 years old they might be normally developed by then, or 50 they might be fine, or can they really say there's long-term effects when they've only assessed them up to 21 years? That's still quite young. Okay, so a little summary of what you need. All the stuff in blue is your AO1, and then the evaluation in red is your AO3. So make sure you've got notes on all of these things, and you should be able to find quite a lot of information from those Tutor2U, Simply Psychology, or also the attachment booklet that you can download digitally from Godalming Online. Okay.